This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another deck history video. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes that have been successful at Magic's highest level of competition, starting from the beginning, and ending with the modern day. As usual, I ran a poll last week where the viewers got to choose the topic for this week's video, and in the end, Burn won a pretty narrow victory over Affinity. And that means that the topic for this video will be Burndex. Burndex tend to be primarily red, and they feature a lot of ways to do direct damage to the opponent. In Magic slang, that's exactly what a burn spell is, a spell that does direct damage to the opponent, so the name makes sense. These decks tend to be capable of incredibly fast wins. Burn decks have been relevant at one time or another in Standard, Modern, Extended, and Legacy, and in this video, we'll take a look at the notable iterations of the deck over the years, examining how burn decks have changed over time and why. We're going to start by looking at burn decks in Standard. Burn spells made their debut way back in Alpha, with the iconic card Lightning Bolt, but a burn deck didn't come into existence until 1995. At Worlds that year, Andrea Reddy reached the top 8 with what I think we can call the first burn deck ever, and it largely follows the template that would go on to be typical for burn decks. The deck runs a decent number of creatures, including low-curve ones like Goblin Balloon Brigade and Orcish Spy. It also ran a bunch of instants and sorceries that could hit creatures or players, most notably Lightning Bolt, Incinerate, and Fireball. In addition to that, it also ran 4 copies of Black Vice for even more damage, and this card really sought to punish the more typical decks that people were playing at the time, which were primarily control decks that drew a ton of cards. Taken together, all of this meant that the opponent took a bunch of damage in a hurry. Now, at the time, this was not called a burn deck. People weren't really naming decks yet for one thing, but at the very least, it is the grandfather of the burn decks we're used to today, so that's why I have dubbed it pre-burn. Another deck so locked in on doing direct damage to the opponent wouldn't exist for quite some time. However, in 1996, a similar deck did emerge, and it came from the same lineage as Andrea Reddy's burn deck, though it was substantially different. That year, Paul Sly piloted a mono-red deck at a Pro Tour qualifier in Atlanta, which featured a very low curve and a decent number of burn spells like Lightning Bolt, Incinerate, and Fireball. While it sounds obvious to us these days, curving out with creatures wasn't something that most decks were doing in the early days of Magic, so this was actually a big moment. However, I would not define this deck as a burn deck, or as the father of burn decks even. It's more like their uncle. I say this because the deck really didn't run that many burn spells, which to me seems like a prerequisite to be considered a burn deck in the first place. Instead, this deck was a more traditional aggro deck, although it wasn't traditional at the time, it was highly innovative. Paul Sly's deck spawned decks sporting his last name, which over time evolved into what we call now Red Deck Wins. These days, Red Deck Wins and burn decks, while related, are not one and the same. The main difference is that burn decks run a lot fewer creatures than Red Deck Wins, which is much more focused on curving out and attacking than burn decks are. Burn decks tend to play a couple creatures early and then cast burn spells for most of the rest of the game. In short, decks that are dubbed Red Deck Wins are creature-based decks that use burn spells for reach, not a deck that plans to do the bulk of its damage with burn spells. However, at this early stage of competitive play in the 1990s, some decks sporting the Sly name would be called burn decks today. I'll get around to doing Red Deck Wins at some point in this series, and in that video we'll delve more into the history of Sly decks, but for now let's focus only on the Sly decks running a ton of ways to do direct damage to the opponent, as I think those are the only ones we can legitimately call burn decks. Now, let's jump ahead to 1998, the next time a burn deck would be top tier. At the World Championship of 1998, 3 of the top 8 decks were very similar Sly decks. While they sported a decent number of creatures, they ran a lot less than the OG Sly deck, and they also ran a ton of ways to do direct damage. While Lightning Bolt was no longer in Standard at this point, there were still some pretty impressive options. Fire Blast was a burn spell that could be cast for free, often allowing for a ton of damage to be done in a single turn, and Hammer of Bogarden provided you with a recurring source of damage. This was important, because the biggest weakness for burn decks has always been that if they run out of gas, they're done, but the Hammer makes sure that even if you're flooding out, you can keep damaging your opponent. Some of the creatures the deck ran also felt a whole lot like burn spells, like Ball Lightning and Fire Slinger. Ball Lightning often amounted to being a 3-mana spell that did 6 damage, and Fire Slinger provided a repeatable source of damage that could pressure the opponent. Perhaps the biggest innovation in these 3 decks, though, was the inclusion of Cursed Scroll. At first glance, this artifact may not look like much, but it's far stronger than it looks. Once you were in top deck mode, you could damage your opponent with the scroll every turn, and that meant that, like with Hammer of Bogarden, you could keep doing damage even when the game got a little later than is ideal for you. After Worlds in 1998, standard Burndex went quiet for a while, and another successful standard burn deck didn't emerge until more than a decade later, in 2014. At Grand Prix San Antonio that year, Gareth I piloted an Izzet burn deck to a top 8 finish. This deck had fairly typical construction for a burn deck. It ran a ton of spells that could do direct damage, like Lightning Strike and Stoke the Flames, and it ran some fairly aggressive creatures. The most notable one in this deck is Monastery Swiftspear, which would go on to be a key card in all burn decks and formats she was legal in. This little 1-mana 1/2 with haste came with the new, at the time, prowess mechanic, which meant that any non-creature spell you cast would give the Swiftspear +1/+1. This obviously pairs incredibly well alongside burn spells, as it allows you to do even more damage, even more quickly. The deck also ran blue to cast the powerful draw spell Treasure Cruise. Burn decks tend to load the graveyard quickly, so casting Treasure Cruise for a low cost and drawing some more burn spells wasn't that difficult. Still, this was really the only burn deck to find success in the standard of the time, and there hasn't really been another one since then. Let's transition now to looking at extended burn decks. If you don't know, extended is a now defunct rotating format which generally featured the last 4 years of cards or so. At Grand Prix Hiroshima, Fujita Tsuyoshi top 8'd with a deck simply called Burn. This was actually the first time in Magic history that a deck with that simple yet descriptive name managed to top 8 an event. While Lightning Bolt wasn't around in the extended of 2003, the deck did still have access to lots of efficient ways to do direct damage. Firebolt and Lava Dart came with Flashback, allowing each of them to be cast twice, while cards like Urza's Rage and Volcanic Hammer could do some pretty significant damage. The deck also utilized the Cursed Scroll plan, while also bringing along a creature that was also a repeatable source of damage, Grim Lavamancer. The Lavamancer can cash in all those cards you cast for a repeatable source of 2 damage, and Grim Lavamancer would go on to be a fixture in burn decks. The next burn deck to top 8 in extended was Andre Posada's Naya burn deck at Grand Prix Hanover in 2009. This version of Burn went 3 colors to gain access to some new powerful creatures, Wild Nacatl most notably. Adding white to the mix also allowed the deck to run the powerful Lightning Helix, which was basically Lightning Bolt stapled to Healing Salve, which is pretty great. While it didn't have access to Ball Lightning, Hellspark Elemental served a very similar purpose. It was smaller, but also came with Unearth, allowing you to use up some of your mana in the later game for some additional damage. One important inclusion in this deck is Sulfuric Vortex. This solves 2 age-old problems for burn decks. First, life gain can make games impossible to win, as it essentially blanks some of your burn spells. The Vortex keeps your opponent from being able to gain life. It also fills the role of a repeatable source of direct damage, since in the late game it will just keep chipping away at your opponent even if you run out of gas. Believe it or not, this is pretty much the complete history of burn decks in Extended. The format ceased to exist in 2012 and no new burn variants emerged before then. However, the creation of the modern format in 2011 would be important in the history of burn decks, as that format would go on to be the place where burn decks have found the most success. Now, burn decks didn't immediately find a ton of success in the new format. It took a few years to get there. Burn's rise to prominence in Modern all began at Grand Prix Kobe in 2014, where 2 different red-white burn decks made it into the top 8. A lot of Bo Sun's decks should look familiar to you. After all, it utilizes cards like Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, and Hellspark Elemental, but it also has a whole bunch of cards we haven't talked about yet. Modern really has access to a critical mass of powerful burn spells that could do a ton of damage for the investment. Lava Spike, Rift Bolt, and Shard Volley provided 3 additional burn spells that could do 3 damage for an investment of only a single mana, while Boros Charm was a modal card that featured a powerful burn effect as one of its options. This was also the first burn deck to top 8 an event that utilized Goblin Guide, one of the most powerful 1-drops in the game. Still, pretty much all of those cards had been legal in Modern since the format was created in 2011, so what changed? Well, the biggest thing was the printing of Eidolon of the Great Revel in 2014. This was the card burn decks needed to be pushed over the top. While the effect is symmetrical and actually ends up damaging you a lot, the fact that you're also firing a bunch of spells at your opponent's dome doesn't make this feel symmetrical, as the damage they have to take just to cast spells will suddenly put them in lethal range. Since being printed, Eidolon of the Great Revel has been part of pretty much every good burn deck in both Modern and Legacy. Boros Burn wasn't the only burn variant in Modern either. In December of 2014, Luke Antonio Salvidio piloted a Jeskai burn deck to a top 8 at Grand Prix Milan. By this point, Khans of Tarkir had been released, and the set shook up the format significantly. First, it now meant that Burndex had access to another 1-mana haste creature who could do a bunch of damage in Monastery Swiftspear, who we mentioned earlier. In addition to that, it was now well worth it to play blue in Burndex because of Treasure Cruise. As I noted earlier, Burndex tended to load their graveyard quickly with all those instants and sorceries, and Treasure Cruise gave Burndex some much needed fuel in the late game. However, the very next month, Treasure Cruise was banned in Modern. The banning wasn't just the result of the Jeskai burn deck, as virtually every deck in Modern now needed to run Treasure Cruise to have a chance. The banning of Treasure Cruise made Jeskai Burn a pretty short-lived burn variant in Modern, and most burn decks for the next year or so would revert back to the Boros burn build. In general, the core of modern burn decks has remained the same all the way through to the modern day. Burn decks tend to include hasty, efficient creatures like Goblin Guide and Monastery Swiftspear. They also run Eidolon of the Great Revel and a bunch of powerful burn spells. Still, there were some slight variations of this deck over the years, so let's look at a few of those. In late 2015, a new Naya Burn variant emerged in Modern. This deck first showed up at Grand Prix Porto Alegre, where 2 of the top 8 decks were Naya Burn. This deck added green to the mix, not only for Wild Nacatl, which we've seen before, but also for the powerful Atarka's Command. This command only costs 2 mana and gives burn decks tons of great options. Pumping your whole board and doing 3 to the opponent can often just end up being lethal damage out of nowhere, and you even have the option to make it so your opponent can't gain life for a turn, something that is sometimes needed in burn decks, especially after sideboarding, when your opponent will almost assuredly be bringing in life gain. This burn variant didn't have a super long period of success, but it did a pretty good job in both 2015 and 2016. Modern Burn didn't undergo another significant change until 2019. At Grand Prix Sao Paulo that year, Javier Viuta top-aided with a burn deck featuring some brand new cards from Ravnica Allegiance, which had been released earlier that year. The core of Javier's deck was of course the same as all the modern decks we've looked at so far, but the 2 new cards it added powered it up significantly. Those cards are Skewer the Critics and Light Up the Stage. Both of them have Spectacle, which means they can be cast for a much cheaper alternate cost if you have damaged your opponent, and well, damaging the opponent is exactly what burn decks have always been about, so casting them for their discounted rate was easy. Skewer gave burn decks access to yet another 1-mana spell that could do 3 damage, while Light Up the Stage helped make sure you continue to draw new sources of damage to finish off your opponent. Skewer the Critics has gone on to be an automatic inclusion in burn decks since then, while Light Up the Stage is played a little less frequently. Modern burn decks today still look pretty much like Javier's. While Modern is certainly the format where burn decks have been the most successful, there is still one format where burn decks have found some success, and that's Legacy. It actually took a pretty long time for a Legacy burn deck to be successful at the highest level of competition, but it all came together in 2017 when Jérôme Gendarme top-aided the European Legacy Championship with a burn deck. In a lot of ways, Jérôme's deck was an amalgamation of the best parts of all the burn decks we've talked about so far. It of course runs Eidolon of the Great Revel, but it also has access to Sulfuric Vortex, giving the deck 2 different sources of repeatable damage. It also runs spells that do 3 damage for 1 mana that we've already seen, like Lightning Bolt and Rift Bolt. It also runs the free burn spell Fire Blast, but there are also a few cards that we haven't seen yet. For example, it also adds Chain Lightning to the mix. Price of Progress is also a really important card for Legacy burn decks. People run so many non-basic lands in Legacy that Price of Progress can do a ton of damage. Meanwhile, the only non-basics in Legacy burn decks tend to be fetch lands, so you'll never really be taking damage yourself from it. Legacy burn decks still pretty much look the same as Jérôme's deck today. Well, that's a history of burn decks. There is a poll on my community tab where you can help choose the topic of next week's video, so don't forget to vote. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on some of my other videos, including other deck histories and MTG top 10s that look at the game's history, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Finally, if you like hearing me talk about Magic history, consider subscribing to my other channel, Needs a Hone History, where I talk about medieval and religious history. Thanks for watching.